Hello, and welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and a software developer at Axonic, Sarah Torrey. In this episode, I spoke with my colleague in Axon Framework's lead developer, Steven van Beelen, about data migration. We talked about various scenarios when this might be needed. We also discussed what is necessary to prepare for migrating data and what to be cautious about in this process. I hope you like my talk with Steven, and let's have a listen. Hi, Steven. How are you doing today?
Hey, Sarah. I'm doing great. Thanks for asking.
So
I hope
happy to have you.
yeah, I hope you're doing good as well.
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Nice.
It's pretty early, but I'm so happy to be starting my day talking to you. It's always a pleasure. So, a little nerdy joke. We're on episode 2 of season 4, so we're on 42, baby.
Oh damn! This podcast is going to bring all the answers everybody needs, right? And then that's all they ever need. We don't need to do any more recordings after this. It's just done.
Exactly. This is
Wow.
it. This is the perfect recording, the perfect episode. You don't need any more.
No, I didn't expect
Oh,
it would
this is
be.
great.
It would be me though. That's what a
Hey,
what a pressure.
you're a very special guest.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Lovely.
Oh, this is great. Well, we're going to talk about data migration today. So
All right.
let's talk about different scenarios when we come to data migration and trying to figure out how to basically move your data from one system to another system, from one place to another place. So in Axon Server, of course, we have 2 different editions. We have the Axon Server Standard Edition, which basically uses one node. There's really no backups. Better for sort of like testing things out and playing around with Axon Server itself. And then we have the Enterprise Edition, which is better for production scenarios and things like that. So let's start with that. Let's say somebody is starting their project or trying out the Axon Server and seeing if that works for their particular use case. And then they decide to move from Axon Server Standard Edition into the Enterprise Edition. How does the data migration work in that scenario? Can you walk me through that?
Yeah, I think I can take you through some of the steps.
Great.
Yeah, honestly, it's not going to be overly complex as far as I'd say. So when you're using Axon Server Standard Edition, that is, you'd honestly just have a single context, right? Just
Right.
a single one, and this is one place to flow all your messages through, but also one place for your events. If you're going to enterprise, you get the option to go for multiple contexts, so that you essentially have separate data streams, separate event stores.
Right.
So this means that if you're going from standard to enterprise, you need to be conscious in what kind of context you put the old one. By default, it would be called default, and likely you want it to be a bit of a different name.
Yeah.
So yeah, you change that around to whatever name works within your domain.
So you have that option of editing it to whatever name you want. It's not something set.
No, it's something in the configuration. It's not like the file has that name. It's the directory where it's stored at, which typically has that name. But all that is configurable. So
Okay, nice.
we do say that everything's 0 configuration. Yes, you can get started with 0 configuration, but obviously you got options and choices. Everybody wants those options and choices around. So,
Of course.
yeah.
Nice. So in that case, it's an easier scenario, of course, because you're just basically going from a simpler version into a little bit more complex. You do have ways to personalize it to however you want it. Now, what about the other way around? If you are going from Enterprise Edition to Standard Edition, which I'm not sure what the use case would be or what kind of examples, if you have any examples where somebody has done that already. I'm not sure why you would want to make that switch goes and sort of downgrading. I don't know.
Yeah.
But how do you
I
how do you manage that?
I don't know. I don't think any of our users, not that I'm aware of at least, have done that or have tried that. It does bring that predicament about the multi-context scenario.
Yeah.
If you have been using multiple contexts, you have been separating your events into distinct stores, into distinct files on your file system, as Axon Server does that. And you can't really automatically merge those. So this would be somewhat problematic. The easiest way to do go back from enterprise to standard is essentially to run several editions of standard. So
Okay.
how I mean that, let's assume you have an enterprise setup. You got three contexts. That's what you defined. So three distinct message buses for every type, and three event stores.
Hmm.
Now you want to go back to a standard edition solution. Okay, fair. Standard edition doesn't allow us this multi-context logic.
Hmm.
So the most pragmatic means to still break it up using standard is to run standard edition three times for every
Okay.
context.
Hmm.
That would be the easiest approach to take.
Right.
Um, you would still need to. So the enterprise edition uses raft for consensus. That would no longer apply. So you would remove that as far as I'm
Hmm.
concerned. And you might need to tweak the configuration again if you have set up things like access control and user management and roles and stuff like that,
Hmm.
because those used to be mixed and now you're breaking that apart as well.
Right.
So that's going to be some work, sure.
Hmm. Yeah.
Not overly ideal, but it's doable. I think, yeah.
In that in that case, then can you um, basically decide which context goes to which standard edition? Do you have any sort of configuration that can help with that, or does it basically the enterprise edition basically the your leader decides which context goes where? Does that make sense at all?
No, you got complete freedom in this case. It's
Okay.
like when you're using the multi-context scenario, you could almost state that Axon Server Enterprise itself is running Axon Server three times if you
Okay.
got three contexts.
Hmm.
And which of the Axon Server instances is in charge of a given context, it's
Hmm.
entirely up to you.
Okay.
So there's
Great.
there's yeah, the also not really any level of configuration. It's just an operator in a terminal moving files
Mhm.
from one direction to another or
To another.
directory to another. Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And then, in the case of sensitive data, or if you were, say, using our protection module inside of the enterprise edition, or you have some security things that are set up within the enterprise, is it then easy to use sort of similar services in the standard edition, or does that make any difference at all in
So the
terms of
data,
security or data protection? Yep.
yeah, fair point, Sarah. The data protection module we provide doesn't care whether you use Axon Server as the event store or whatever other variant to store events in. It doesn't care about that. So that would
Hmm.
just work. Granted that you're not using the Axon Server plugin of the data
Right.
protection module, because the logic of plugins and extensions, that's also an enterprise specific thing.
Ah,
So
okay.
if you would be using those,
Mhm.
well, then you need to provide something else. If you're
Okay.
using the plain, or the plain, is that the right way of putting it? I think the old fashioned version of the data protection model, just a regular one that you run with your Axon Framework app,
Okay.
well, then it
Hmm.
runs with your Axon Framework application. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So then there's no problem with that. Okay.
Nope.
Great.
Nope.
Great. So there is the another scenario which I actually failed to cover first is if you're going from standard edition to standard edition, I'm assuming it's going to be a fairly easy process because then you're just migrating data from one context to another context.
Yeah.
That's
No,
not going to be a
there's no.
problem.
No, exactly.
If you are then going from one Axon Server Enterprise Edition, let's say, instead of context, and you want to migrate to another Axon Server Enterprise Edition, again, not sure what the use case would be or what the reason would that be if you need to
Hmm.
move from one Axon Server Enterprise to another one. Is that possible? How easy it is? Is it easy? Do people want to do that?
Um, I'm thinking when this might be reasonable. I think if you've got several environments for your when you're building your application, so you got a test and an acceptance and a production.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the pleasure of working at a project where we wanted to validate all our events from production against what we were writing in development. So
Right.
because you're changing your event structure, right? Maybe you
Mm-hmm.
introduce some upcasters, but
Right.
potentially you forget to do that. Well, the best way to test whether your events actually work with what you've got built is
Mm-hmm.
to read those from
Right.
production environment to an acceptance environment. So that's what we did. We pushed
Okay.
all the events. We did anonymize some of the data. We didn't have a
Mhm.
data protection model back then, so we didn't have any form of crypto erasure. So we
Yeah.
did that ourselves, and we just pushed them through the upcasters. But long story short, this would be potentially a case where you would go from an enterprise solution running your production setup to an
Mhm.
acceptance environment where you want the events from that location to go over to another location. So
Gotcha.
purely for testing, I think that would be reasonable.
Yeah.
As far as the data goes, so when I'm talking about data, I mean specifically the events.
Mhm.
Um, that shouldn't be that big a deal, other than just again moving the files to the right directories.
Yeah.
But if you're going from enterprise to another, then you need to initialize the cluster
Mhm.
well enough.
Mhm.
So using either the init cluster functionality that Axon Server Enterprise provides,
Yeah.
or the cluster templates to just kickstart it, that would be helpful. Yeah.
Right, makes sense. Two points that you mentioned that I'd like to sort of dig a little bit deeper into. One was the notion of the clusters and also upcasters. So let's talk about clusters a little bit. So let's say if somebody is using the enterprise edition and they, for instance, have 3 nodes in that cluster, but then
Mm-hmm.
they want to add additional nodes to it. Let's say you're going from 3 to 5, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you, in that case, migrate any data? Do you leave the data as is, and it just adds to, the rest of the um, CPU memory, what have you, that you have added with the addition of nodes and your
Mm-hmm.
backups and things like that? Do we need to at all care at all about the data migration in this case, or is not even an issue?
In all honesty, you could simply add an Axon Server node
Hmm.
and let it be part of the cluster, and it will notice that it's all far behind. It doesn't have any
Hmm.
of the events yet. So what it
Right.
will start doing is replicating all the data,
Hmm.
regardless of how many contexts you've defined. If it's 1, if it's 10, 20, it doesn't care.
It
It
just
will
copies
just,
it, right?
exactly, as long as it's part of those contexts, if it belongs to those replication groups, then it will add that information. Um, that might take some time though. So it's not the most efficient way to do things. What you can do is just take you want to have that node contain the same set of events for fault tolerance reasons as well, but also so that they can form a fair consensus over what new event you want to introduce. So taking the events from your existing nodes, copying the files, and pushing them to your new node will be a lot faster. I think best in this case would be to just copy over the closed files so that those are filled up segments, so to say. And then there's always one segment that's being written to actively. I wouldn't necessarily copy that so that it
Right.
can just replicate the active file segment. And for the rest, it can, well, get a flying start, so to say.
Gotcha. Now, you did mention that if it's in the same replication group, what if it's not in the same replication group?
If it doesn't belong to the replication group, then apparently it doesn't need to replicate that
Doesn't
data.
matter. Yeah,
No, no,
doesn't matter. So
exactly.
even easier.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, perfect. Let's talk about upcasters. So that was another thing that you had mentioned.
Yeah.
Um, why does it matter to talk about the upcasters, and how do we sort of manage these scenarios when you have an upcaster, whether or as opposed to when you're not
Yeah,
dealing with
yeah,
upcasters?
exactly. Yeah, so this is definitely one of the things I slipped you on a paper, so to say, because I wanted to talk about this because I think
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
important to cover this. Um, from a theoretical stance, you would keep your events as is always. Period. You
Hmm.
don't change them, right? It's
Right.
it's a fact. It's history. You can't change history in real life, so you don't change your event store either. It's a similar
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
Now, that's the theory behind it. But in practice, you will come to a point that you likely want to change your events. So you want
Right.
to change the structure. You need to add fields, remove fields, rename fields, split an event into several or merge
Hmm.
several. Um, all things you need to be conscious about if you do it, sure. So we got some help for this. The framework provides upcasters to help you
Yeah.
with this whenever sensible messaging defaults don't work, being forward and
Hmm.
backward compatible
Right.
in that case. Um, Now, what if you have written more than 100 upcasters. What happens if you're reading events from in an Axon Framework application and you got all those upcasters, then all your stream of events will all be pushed through all the upcasters. So if you have 100 of them, well, we try to make it as optimized as possible by ensuring
Yeah.
it only acts on actual events it needs to act to. But still, if the number of upcasters increases, that might simply become a penalty on reading your events. Is
Right.
that's not going to be beneficial at a certain stage.
Hmm.
Noted, the bigger chances that this happens is if your domain is still a little bit in flux, that you're not 100% sure about how to write your events,
Hmm.
or maybe you've written events which are very consisting out of a lot of value objects, and
Right.
all those events carry that value object, meaning that if you change that object, then all your events change.
Exactly.
Yes. So one of my earlier Axon projects, so mind you, was still very much a youngster in the game. We did that. We had some feather events, some feather objects in them,
Hmm.
which were in constant flux because of development cycles.
Right.
So we came to a stage that we had, I don't know, 25 upcasters for over 50 events.
Oof.
So that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And it was just, it wasn't ideal anymore. So
Right.
yes, you could stick to the theory and keep those around till the end of time.
Yeah.
Well, I think
Do
this
you want
was,
to?
yeah. Do you want to? No, no, we didn't want to, at least. So what I would recommend in these cases is go back with your team. Decide:
Hmm.
do we want to manage all these upcasters? Do we really
Hmm.
care about the original format of the event anymore? Does it give us any added value?
Right.
And if not, then maybe, just maybe, it might be smart to rewrite your events.
Okay.
And given the lengthy description I'm giving you here,
Hmm.
I mean this very cautiously, because obviously it breaks with the idea of an event store. You don't change your
Exactly.
data.
You don't change your
But
data. You don't
no,
change your events. Right.
no, exactly. But you know, time moves on, and you need to be compliant with what you need at a later stage as well. So at this specific project, we took that stance that, okay,
Mhm.
we're going to rewrite our events. Um,
And
Axon
I'm so
Framework,
curious to ask you. I know it's beyond the
yeah,
scope of this talk, but
yeah.
can you kind of tell me a little bit? How do you then deal with that? That the notion of event is history, you shouldn't change it. But then eventually you decide that it's changed so many times already within your in your project, within the project,
Mhm.
and using all of these offcasters, it's no longer the same as it was written at the very beginning, and now you
Mhm.
want to rewrite it. How do you go about it?
Yes, exactly. That's where I wanted to go to.
Sorry, this is not
So
about data migration, but I
no,
really want to know.
no, I do think it touches base on this a little bit. So
Okay,
sure,
good.
it's not entirely the same, I guess, but you could almost compare it with going from one Axon server enterprise setup to another,
Hmm.
because that's
Okay.
also, well, it's still the same application sphere, right? We're
Yeah.
still in the same domain. We are not really changing our infrastructure.
Right.
We're moving the data from one place to another, and sometimes you
Sure.
need to put a map function in the middle to map it
Hmm.
from one
Hmm.
format to another. What the benefit we had was that we did write all those upcasters, because those
Okay.
upcasters
Yeah.
know how to go from the original format to the latest. So we wrote a tool, or one use tool though, because you don't need to do that more often. And this tool connected to two event stores, the old one and the new one, which was empty. And it just streamed all the events and pushed all of them through the upcasters. And the upcasted event was then published to the event store. What you need to be mindful in this case is that you keep the same timestamps, because you don't want to
Yeah.
change the time,
Sure.
because
Sure.
that would so don't really do the Axon Framework event bus.publish method, or the
Hmm.
aggregate lifecycle.apply. Don't do that, because that would
Right.
change the timestamp, and that's
Gotcha.
not what you want.
Gotcha.
But yeah, that's what we did. We did keep a
Really
backup
cool.
of the
Really
old
interesting.
events still, just
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
certainty. You know,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
don't know. Maybe you need it. Um,
Right.
yeah. So that would be,
Really cool.
yeah. That's what we did. and it was
Nice.
an interesting endeavor, and everybody was very excited and very scared, and but yeah,
Was everybody excited at the end of the project too, or
that it
just
worked.
scared?
Yes, yeah, no, we were very excited that it worked out,
Nice,
but we did test it
that's
very thoroughly, so yeah, which
nice,
I would
nice.
recommend as
That's
well.
exactly that's what
Yeah.
matters, right? Very cool, very cool. So we covered the upcasters. Now, let's say we want to, for instance, now changing the data from, say, one format to another format, right? Let's say you have your data stored as an XML, and then you want to move to, let's say, JSON or something like
Yeah,
that, or
yeah, yeah, yeah.
different. How do you deal with that then? Because I know with, um, I think by default we store the data in XML. Is that correct?
Yes,
And then
correct.
if somebody
Yeah.
wants to use JSON, then that's
You,
a little bit different story. But anyhow, if you want to move the data from XML to JSON, how do you go about it?
yeah, that's honestly not that different a tool. It's just
Mm.
the map function, which in the previous example were the upcasters, right
Yeah.
now is the serializers. So
Hmm.
you're using a serializer to read from the old format, and then use another serializer, the JSON one, to go to the new one.
Right.
That would be a means to do this
Hmm.
if you don't want to keep the fact that you used to store it in XML. Maybe that is valuable information. Who knows?
Mm.
Um, if you don't want to do a rewrite in this case, because this might not always be ideal, um, you can also write a custom serializer if you'd want. I'm not sure
Okay.
whether that's the best approach. Definitely something to deduce with your team, but you can
Right.
write a wrapper around the serializer that just uses both. That knows, okay, I'm going to check, I'm going to poke the event saying, is this XML? Oh, it's XML. Then I use the extreme variant, and then
Hmm.
poke it again for another event saying, is this XML? Oh, no, it's not XML. Then it's likely JSON. Yeah, it's JSON. It's a newer event. And then you
Right.
use JSON. The
Gotcha.
fact I'm saying this is that what's also good to note about event stores, that sure, we keep everything, but
Hmm.
likely you're using the last bit of the store most. So
Right.
if there is a moment that you switch over from XML to JSON, eventually the chances become slimmer and slimmer that you're using your XML events
Hmm.
and you're going
Hmm.
to your JSON events.
Right. So,
Granted, this also depends on the domain and the scope, the life cycle of your aggregates and your query models, and
right.
a lot of it
Yeah.
depends. But
It just depends. Everything
yes,
depends. But it is
always.
possible, and it's
Yeah.
not it's not a difficult endeavor, which is good. So we covered a lot of things within Axon server and moving between different editions and so forth. Now, what if you are using Axon server and then you decide not to for any reason?
Mhm.
How do you then migrate your data out of Axon server altogether?
Yeah. This is also a very honest question. I think the other way around would also work, right? Maybe you started
Hmm.
with a non-Axel server setup using
Yeah,
APA or
absolutely.
JDBC or home behold the
So let's
Mongo
start with
event storage
that.
engine.
How do
Yeah,
you
no,
bring it into
yeah,
Axon Framework and how do you get it out of Axon?
exactly.
Let's
To,
start with the beginning.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure, sure. To bring it in Axel server, we actually provide a migration tool.
Okay.
So whenever you're downloading the Axon server runnable, you get a
Hmm.
migration runnable with that, which you
Okay.
need to configure, saying, okay, you need to go to this store database or this Mongo document store. This is where you read the events, and then you push it to this Axon server node. So that's all relatively straightforward. The documentation
Hmm.
is in place.
Nice.
The other way around, though, going from Axon server to a non-Axon server setup, so going back to JPA or JDBC or Mongo, well, we don't have an unmigration tool. I'm not sure if that's what you would call this, but
We don't help
uh,
you out on the way out. No, just kidding. You're on your own,
no,
buddy.
exactly. No, no, that would be me. We
No,
don't
no,
do that.
absolutely not. No,
No, we don't. No, we don't want to lock in everybody. That doesn't. That wouldn't be
no, of
friendly.
course not.
No,
No.
we would again go to a similar setup as we have with the upcasters and the serializer logic, but now the mapper is again different.
Hmm.
We're reading from an Excel service store and writing to a JPA, JDBC, or a Mongo store,
Yeah.
and that's all there is to. And then the map function isn't really existent anymore in this case because you're
Right.
not changing the data
Hmm.
as we were with the upcasters and the serializers. But
Yeah.
yeah, that would be the most pragmatic step. So it means, by the way, writing a very simple Axon framework application using or configuring two stores. So that isn't default for the framework. So you do need to deal with the configuration yourself there. Have a streaming event processor likely. So either a tracking or a pooled streaming variant, read from and let that read from one store and let it write to the other one in an
Gotcha.
event-handling component.
Yeah, makes sense. So, from what I'm hearing, fairly straightforward how to migrate your data within various platforms and stores.
Mm-hmm.
But you do have to plan for it very carefully, right? You do have
Yes.
to make sure that things are in place before you make that transition, because it's, even though it seems kind of straightforward, it can actually um, cause you a lot of trouble and headache if it's not planned properly.
No, this is completely correct, Sarah. We haven't really glanced on that yet because if you're running a production setup and
Mhm.
you need to replace the infrastructure underneath because that's essentially what you're doing in most of these cases. Well, yeah, you need to be mindful of that. The simplest, if at all possible, would be to do a big bang deployment, so to say. So kill the old app, do the migration, and start up the new one. Well, that does give downtime,
Yeah.
so that might not be ideal. In a lot
Mhm.
of cases, that isn't ideal anymore. So you could think about a blue-green deployment strategy. So you're preparing the new store whilst the other one is still running. And then you do need you have some form of layover period still that you want to keep that window as small as possible. So likely do it with outside of office hours if you have any of that with your application. Um, and yeah, you could also think about doing a rolling upgrade as a deployment, although that would be some configuration and coding as well to be certain that your application can read from both, write from both, and your new variant also does that so that it can do that step. Um, if you really need zero downtime, you need to invest development work in that. That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. Um, One thing that I wanted to also ask you is the notion of the backup. So, we talked a little bit earlier about using Axon Server Standard Edition, and obviously, with that, you only have one context, and there's not much of a backup going on. How do you back up your data in that case? For any reason, if you need to store some of this data somewhere else, for whatever reason, your um, Axon server, I don't know, doesn't function properly,
Mhm.
how do you deal with the backup then in that case?
Yeah, so when you're not using the enterprise edition, it's not the distributed consent, not the raft protocol, which automatically duplicates your data anymore.
Of
Yeah,
course, yeah.
so you'd need to do that yourself. That's true.
So locally,
Axon,
you have to, yeah,
yeah, the Axon
yeah.
server provides two, I believe three at least, but you're doing the standard edition. So in this case, it would be two endpoints. One which gives you all the file names that are closed. So all the file names of the event segments and the snapshots segments you have, so that you can validate based on that file list. Okay, this is what I have. This is what I haven't backed up yet. So you can pick the ones you haven't backed up, and then you need to write a script that just does a copy again from your terminal from one location to another. That would be one. But you also want to have your control database. So where the control logic of Axon Server is situated, this would be another endpoint you'd have. So you need to do a post operation so that Axon Server Standard Edition can stop for a very small moment in time, make the view, make the backup you want, and then start up again, go further.
Yeah, makes
Yeah.
sense. Um, awesome. Really great set of information and just ways of doing it. This is just really nice. Are there any, I don't know, call it bad practices in migrating your data? I mean, obviously, we talked about planning and things like that. Can
Yes.
you mess it up colossally? I mean, I don't know what can you do that would be considered a really bad practice if you're migrating your data.
What would be considered a bad practice when migrating your data? Let me think. Yeah, not just testing it in production would be a bad practice.
Sure.
Uh,
That would be a
but
bad practice, generally speaking.
yeah, that would be. Whew. I got that
Should
would
be
be
reevaluate your priorities, kind of
yeah,
deal.
yeah, yeah. I would mark you as a cowboy if you do that. So just
Hey, I'm in
shoot
Texas. Bring it.
that is true. That is true. Practice points. I think we covered the majority. You just need to be very conscious. You need to test it as well in an acceptance
Hmm.
environment before you
Yeah.
actually do it. Be certain that everything runs, that it works. Think about the rollback strategy as well,
Hmm.
so that if it
Hmm.
doesn't work or breaks at the last minute, or I don't know, your data center dies at that moment in time,
Yeah.
you need to be able to go back.
Hmm.
So
Makes
don't
sense.
immediately remove the
Yeah.
old event store um, that you're migrating.
Basically, always have a backup plan, right?
Yeah.
You just in
Yes.
case something happens, and losing all of your data, and especially sensitive data for that matter. Yeah, great. Anything that we didn't really cover through my tens of questions that
Yeah.
I asked that you'd like to add?
Mm, no. I'm thinking. I really wanted to cover the upcaster and the serializer a bit because
Nice.
that's always
Yeah.
a question we get during the training as well. Or,
Yeah.
well, not always. A lot of the times you get that saying,
Hmm.
"Oh,
Yeah.
how do you do this? How do you go from one format to another,
Yeah.
serialized format and such?" So I definitely wanted to put that out there. And other than that, what I want to give you is, yeah, it's just another type of data migration, not so differently from other application environments you might have worked in.
Hmm.
So you use common sense. Think about the practices you used back then or you heard about back then.
Yeah.
Sure, reach out to us because when it comes to specifics about the framework and server, well, we obviously know them, so we can
Hmm.
help you out to get some of the caveats. But a lot of
Yeah.
those caveats would consist or exist with any type of application.
Absolutely. And as always, I think it's worth mentioning that the our Discuss platform is always available for questions. And if you're stuck someplace, just ask us. We're generally a nice bunch of people. We don't bite normally.
We do our best.
I no, but yeah, we're always available to answer questions and help wherever we can. So that's
Exactly.
really great, and I really appreciate you giving me your time today. I know you're very busy,
Mhm.
but this was a fun topic to talk about, and so I really appreciate you being available to discuss it and to walk me through different scenarios. Really appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you
sure
so
thing,
much.
Sarah. I I,
Yeah,
um, I enjoy this. This is also nice, right? I want to
awesome.
share. I want to share what we're doing. So
Yeah,
it's good.
absolutely. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Alrighty, until next time we talk. Have a great day.
Yeah. Have a great day, Sarah. See you next time.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Stephen. Please join me next time for other amazing topics with wonderful guests. Until then, have a great time and happy coding!